Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. This time, we're taking a closer look at the life of Betty Ford using an episode of the American History Tellers podcast as our guide. Her story really flips the script on what we typically think of when we hear First Lady, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely. She wasn't content to just stay in the background. I mean, think about it. We're talking about a woman who went from dancing at Carnegie Hall to navigating the world of politics during one of the most chaotic times in American history. It's quite a journey.
It really is. Where do we even begin with a story like that? I mean, talk about breaking the mold.
Well, I think we have to start with her early life. Understanding her upbringing can give us some clues about where that independent spirit and her knack for challenging conventions came from. She was born in 1918. Elizabeth Ann Bloomer, nicknamed Betty, of course, grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Grand Rapids, huh? That doesn't exactly scream future First Lady, does it?
Maybe not. But here's the thing. Even though she came from a well-off family, she wasn't some sheltered debutante. She fell in love with dance at a young age and ended up studying at the Martha Graham School in New York City.
Wait, the Martha Graham School? We're talking about like modern dance royalty here.
Exactly, and it gets even better.
Yeah.
She performed at Carnegie Hall with the Martha Graham Ensemble. I mean, picture a future First Lady gracing that stage. It really shows you the level of talent and dedication she had.
Wow. So how did she end up going from Carnegie Hall to the White House?
Well, life has a way of throwing curveballs, doesn't it? Family circumstances brought her back to Grand Rapids, which kind of put her professional dance career on hold.
So was that the end of her dancing days? Did she settle into a more traditional life after that?
Not quite. Things took an unexpected turn. See, she married William Warren in 1942. But the marriage didn't last. They divorced after 5 years. It was actually during this period of, figuring things out that she met Gerald Ford.
Ah, Gerald Ford, the future president. But back then, he was a World War II veteran just starting out in politics, right?
Exactly. And talk about a whirlwind romance. They got married in 1948, just a few weeks before he was elected to the House of Representatives.
Wow, talk about a life change. So she went from dancing on stage to being a congressman's wife. What a transition.
Yeah, it really was. They moved to Alexandria, Virginia, and Betty dove headfirst into the life of a political spouse, raising their 4 kids, navigating the social scene in D.C.
It's a pretty stark contrast, wouldn't you say? The world of dance, all about self-expression and individuality, and then the more traditional role that was often expected of political wives back then.
You said it. But even in those early years in Washington, you can see glimpses of that independent spirit shining through. Like, remember all those rumors about her past divorce? Well, instead of shying away, she addressed them head on, refused to let it become some big scandal.
That's pretty bold, especially for that time. It sounds like she was already setting the stage for how she'd handle challenges throughout her life. With directness and not letting others define her.
Definitely. And while all this was happening, Gerald Ford's career was taking off. He even served on the Warren Commission. You remember the one that investigated JFK's assassination?
Oh, yeah, the Warren Commission, a huge moment in American history. And then, of course, came Watergate. Talk about a game changer, both for the country and the Fords.
Absolutely. The nation was in a state of shock. Nobody knew what was going to happen next. Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned in the middle of all the chaos, and President Nixon chose Gerald Ford to replace him.
Wow. Just like that, they were thrust onto the national stage at one of the most turbulent times in American political history. What a crazy time to be in the spotlight.
It really was a baptism by fire. And that's where we see Betty Ford step up as Second Lady, handling it all with this amazing mix of composure and honesty.
Speaking of honesty, didn't she cause quite a stir in her first televised interview in 1974?
Oh, yeah, she sure did. She came right out and expressed her support for abortion rights. A lot of people were caught off guard, especially considering her husband's stance on the issue.
That's pretty daring, especially for a political wife at that time. It seems like she was determined to be her own person, regardless of her husband's position.
Absolutely. And remember, this was a time when women's voices were often, silenced or dismissed, especially in politics. So for her to come out so strongly on such a controversial issue, it was a big deal.
And it wasn't just abortion. She was outspoken on a lot of issues, including women's rights. She wasn't afraid to shake things up a bit.
Definitely not. And things were about to get a whole lot more interesting. Less than a year later, President Nixon resigned. And just like that, Gerald Ford became President of the United States.
Talk about a whirlwind, from the dance floor to the White House. So how did Betty Ford handle this sudden shift? What kind of First Lady did she become? And what kind of impact did she have on the country?
Well, that's where things get even more fascinating. We'll dive into all that in the next part of our deep dive.
So we left off with Betty Ford stepping into the role of First Lady at a time when the country was still reeling from Watergate. It must have been a lot to handle.
Oh, absolutely. It was a time of incredible uncertainty. The nation was deeply divided, trust in government was shattered, and here was Betty Ford, someone who had never sought the political spotlight, thrust into this incredibly challenging role.
It's hard to imagine the kind of pressure she must have felt.
It was immense. But you know what? She didn't back down. In fact, she used her platform to connect with the American people in a way that was very real, very human.
Well, one thing that definitely stands out is her decision to be open about her breast cancer diagnosis. That was huge.
Yeah, that was a pivotal moment, not just for her, but for how we talk about women's health. Remember, back then, cancer was a taboo subject, especially for women. There was so much shame and secrecy surrounding it.
And she just chose to put it all out there, to share her experience with the whole country.
Exactly. She had a mastectomy, and she talked about it openly. Can you imagine the courage that took? It was a huge step in breaking down the stigma associated with breast cancer.
It's incredible. I mean, think about it. Here she was, the First Lady, in a position of power. And she was willing to be so vulnerable, so open about something so personal.
It was a game changer. I mean, it sparked a national conversation about breast cancer, encouraged women to be more proactive about their health, to get screenings. It really empowered women to talk about their bodies and their health in a way that just wasn't happening before.
You're so right. And that seems to be a recurring theme with Betty Ford, this willingness to challenge conventions, to be outspoken, even when it made people uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And her openness about her breast cancer diagnosis was just the beginning. Remember that infamous 60 Minutes interview in 1975?
Oh, yeah, the one where she talked about everything from premarital sex to marijuana. I've heard about it, but I don't think I've ever actually seen it.
Well, let me tell you, it was a bombshell. She didn't hold back. She said she wouldn't be surprised if her daughter had an affair.
Wait, really? She said that on national television.
Yep. And she even said that if she were a young person today, she might try marijuana. I mean, this was the 1970s. These were not things that first ladies talked about.
Wow, she really pushed the boundaries. What was their reaction like? I can't even imagine.
Oh, it was a media frenzy. Some people praised her for her honesty and her willingness to address these taboo subjects, but others were outraged. They thought she was being too radical, too outspoken. Some even thought she was unfit to be first lady.
So she was a bit of a lightning rod, huh?
Oh, for sure. But, whether you agreed with her or not, you had to admire her willingness to speak her mind, and she really forced the nation to confront some difficult conversations.
It's amazing to think how much power she had to shape public opinion just by being honest and speaking her truth. But it wasn't all smooth sailing for her, was it? I mean, we know that she struggled with addiction later on.
Yeah, that's another chapter in her story that's both heartbreaking and inspiring. After they left the White House, she faced this whole new battle, a very personal one.
It's a reminder that everyone faces challenges, no matter how successful or powerful they seem. So, what happened? How did she deal with her addiction?
Well, in 1978, her family staged an intervention, and instead of hiding it, she decided to go public with her struggle. She checked herself into the Long Beach Naval Hospital.
The Long Beach Naval Hospital, that seems like an unusual choice.
It was. Most people expected her to go to some fancy rehab center, but she chose a military facility, one that was mostly for active duty personnel.
I wonder why she chose that particular place.
It's hard to say for sure. Maybe she wanted to avoid the media circus that would come with going to a more high-profile rehab. Maybe she was drawn to the structure and discipline of a military environment. Whatever the reason, her choice made a powerful statement. It showed the nation that addiction didn't discriminate. And it showed that seeking help was a sign of strength, not weakness.
She really was a trailblazer in so many ways. And her commitment to helping others dealing with addiction didn't stop there, did it?
Not at all. In 1982, she co-founded the Betty Ford Center.
Ah, the Betty Ford Center. It's become synonymous with addiction treatment.
It really has. And it wasn't just some vanity project. She was deeply involved, attending support group meetings, talking to patients, offering encouragement.
It's hard to imagine the impact of having a former First Lady, someone who had been through so much, sitting there with you, sharing your struggles, offering support.
It must have been incredibly powerful, and it shows just how committed she was to breaking down the stigma around addiction and helping people get the treatment they needed.
She really used her platform to shine a light on issues that so many people were struggling with silently.
She did. And her advocacy didn't stop there. She continued to champion women's rights. She spoke out about HIV/AIDS at a time when there was so much fear and misinformation surrounding it, and she never stopped raising awareness about breast cancer.
It's amazing. She really devoted her life to making a difference. So, looking back at her journey from dancer to first lady to addiction recovery advocate, what do you think are the key takeaways? What can we learn from the life of Betty Ford?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest takeaways is that authenticity matters. She never tried to be anyone other than herself. She was open about her beliefs, her struggles, her triumphs, and her failures. And that honesty resonated with people. It made her relatable, even when they disagreed with her.
She also showed us the importance of being vulnerable, asking for help when you need it.
Exactly. Her decision to go public with her addiction was a huge step in normalizing conversations about mental health and addiction. It showed people that it's okay to not be okay, and that seeking help is a sign of strength.
And finally, I think she demonstrated the power of using your platform for good, whatever that platform may be. She could have easily faded into the background after leaving the White House, but instead she chose to keep speaking out, keep fighting for the things she believed in.
Absolutely. She showed us that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter who we are or what our past may hold. And she did it all with this incredible blend of grace, humor, and determination. It's really quite inspiring.
It's really striking to see how all these seemingly different pieces of Betty Ford's life, the artist, the political figure, the advocate, all fit together.
It's like there's this through line, you know?
Mhm.
And I think that through line is authenticity. She was always true to herself, even when it meant challenging expectations or making people uncomfortable.
And that's what made her so relatable, right? She wasn't afraid to show her flaws, her struggles. It made her seem human, approachable.
Absolutely. It made it okay for other people to be imperfect, too. She really broke down a lot of those barriers around women's health, around addiction, around the idea that people in positions of power have to be perfect all the time.
I keep thinking back to how she reconnected with her love for the arts after leaving the White House. It's almost like she was coming full circle, returning to that core part of herself.
I think you're right. It's like those passions never really leave us, do they? They might get pushed aside for a while, but they're always there, waiting to be rekindled. And for Betty Ford, art was more than just a hobby. It was a way to connect with people on a deeper level.
And she made sure that the arts had a place in her legacy. I mean, remember, she and President Ford created the Gerald Ford Presidential Library and Museum in Michigan and the Betty Ford Center in California.
And those institutions weren't just about preserving their political legacy. They were also about promoting education, understanding, and appreciation for the arts.
She really believed in the power of art to inspire and to heal, didn't she?
Oh, absolutely. And her support for the arts went beyond just museums and libraries. She was a huge advocate for arts education, too. She understood that it was essential for fostering creativity and critical thinking in young people.
So even as she was dealing with her own health challenges, she never lost sight of the bigger picture. She kept fighting for the things she believed in.
That's what's so inspiring about her story, isn't it? She never stopped trying to make a difference, even when things were tough.
When we look back at Betty Ford's life, all the twists and turns, the triumphs and the struggles, what do you think her legacy is? How will she be remembered?
I think she'll be remembered as a woman who defied expectations, who redefined what it meant to be a first lady. She showed the world that you can be strong and vulnerable, outspoken and compassionate, all at the same time.
And she did it all with such grace and humility.
Exactly. And I think one of the most important lessons we can take away from her life is that it's okay to be imperfect, to make mistakes, to not have all the answers.
What matters is that we stay true to ourselves, that we keep learning and growing, and that we use our voices to make a positive impact on the world.
She really was a remarkable woman. And I think her story will continue to inspire people for generations to come.
Well said. And I hope our listeners are feeling inspired too. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life of Betty Ford. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving to make the world a better place.